Federico, we are back with another episode of App Stories. This episode is sponsored by Devon Think, Revenue Cat, and Pinstachio. I'm John Voorhees, of course, and Federico, who is our editor-in-chief at Mac Stories, is with me to talk about everything apps. We're going to start, though, and with our segment, What's New? Because I want to know what you've been up to, Federico. What's going on?
Hello, it's good to be back. I have been up to many things. I mentioned this when you called me. Like, I'm at the stage where I am slightly dissatisfied with a bunch of things in my digital life.
How so?
Well, I mean, take a look at the episode title today. Just the fact that we are continuing to imagine the perfect app means that we have wishes that are not being granted by developers right now. So
that is a fair assessment, yes.
But one of the things that I was taking a look at recently, and I thought to myself, I don't like this. I gotta do something. I gotta fix it. My setup in Craft. So I absolutely love Craft, the note-taking app, and I love how quickly the developers are iterating on it. We've basically reached the point where there's weekly updates for the iOS app, which is a great sign. It's always a good sign to see that kind of support. It was mostly my problem, not a problem with the app itself. I mentioned many times before how I created this note in Craft called the dashboard, which is sort of like a main note. Some people call it a scratch pad. Some other people call it the home page. It's basically a single note that contains at the very top a series of links, sort of like jumping points to quickly navigate via a deep link to other pages or other sections of Craft. And so that's at the top. And at the bottom, just a blank space where I can type anything I want. And the idea is this is a page that I go to when I want to quickly jump to a specific project that I'm working on, or if I want to save something for later that doesn't yet belong in my task manager, but that I know is something that I'm supposed to take care of at some point in the near future. It's that is something that I feel like GTD-inspired task managers, they have never really quite figured out that intermediate step in between, you have to do something, you're just not ready to commit to turning that something into an actual item that has a due date, that has a project, that has a context, that weird sort of influx in between state.
Right. It might not even be a task yet. It may be something you won't know what the task is until you read this link or something like that.
Exactly. Something like, think about this, like the idea of I'm supposed to sit down and think about something, and that may or may not become a task eventually.
Right.
And I guess that's task managers, they have an inbox, but I don't know. Whenever I try to use the inbox in apps like OmniFocus or things, you know what the outcome is? I keep forgetting that I have things in the inbox, and they just keep accumulating, and I forget about them.
Yeah, it becomes a mess.
It becomes a mess.
It's a mess. It's a mess. Yeah, I've done that too, and I think it's a big mistake. At least for me, I can't really handle having those kind of things in my task manager, so I end up putting them elsewhere too.
Exactly. So I guess this dashboard note was a way for me to create this virtual thinking space of sorts, where I can save things that they're not notes, they are not tasks. I don't know what they are, but it's a good place to jot them down, and I can find them later. So that bottom half of the page still works pretty well. What I didn't like was the organization of the upper section with the quick links. So I'm trying something new. Until Craft adds support for native tables on, not on mobile, tables at all. They don't support tables, not even on the desktop at the moment. I redid my list of quick links. I'm using emoji as visual indicators, and I'm grouping related links together on the same line. Now, something interesting about these links, what I discovered a while back is that in Craft, you can so if you are in a workspace, you can type the @ character, or you can type, I guess, a double square bracket, and you can link to any other note or page or section of a note within the same workspace you are currently in.
Right, because those are basically backlinks.
Those are backlinks. Yes. So if you are in the same workspace, you can link to anything. You have a visual preview. You can navigate it on iPad with the arrow keys, and you can just press enter to confirm, and you create a link. Now, my problem was I also wanted to create links to notes that were in other workspaces, like the one that John and I share. What I found out is that I don't know if it's a bug. I hope it's not a bug. It shouldn't be a bug. I discovered that if you copy the deep link, so the URL scheme, which is craftdocs : / something of a note, and then if you create like a markdown link in another workspace, it turns into a rich link. It turns into a tappable link that takes you to that note without switching your workspace. So, for example, I don't know, John, if you can embed this screenshot in our show notes.
Yeah,
somehow.
I should be able to do that.
But if you take a look, there's the third item on the list called App Stories Show Notes. Now, that is in a different workspace. This screenshot was taken in the Teachy workspace, which is my personal one. But the App Stories Show Notes is a note that is in the John and Teachy workspace. But if I tap it because I created this link via the deep link method, Craft will navigate to that note without switching the workspace. So this is perfect for me because I can quickly jump to a different note from a different workspace without switching the personal workspace I'm currently in, and it's perfect. So it's a little convoluted to put it together because you got to copy the deep link to a note, and then you got to basically create like a markdown link. So the way I do it is square bracket, and then I typed App Stories Show Notes, square bracket, parentheses, paste the link, parentheses, and you press space, and it turns from a markdown plain text syntax into a tappable link. But it works. So
yeah, that's a good tip because I've used deep links to do things like share one of our, even if it's one of the notes that's already in our shared space, if there's something that I want you to take a look at that's new that I put in, I'll often send you the deep link. And I've been using them that way, but I haven't used them this way yet. And this is a good idea because I need that kind of thing because I've got a similar setup to this little, some of the, actually, even some of the same links with the podcast and things, but I really need to have those deep links here because it's probably about half the things I want in this section are in our shared space and half of them are in my personal space. Yeah. So yeah, it's that's a good tip. And I think it's intended because you've got permissions in both of those spaces. I know it works the same way on the Mac too, where, for instance, right now as we're recording, I'm in our John and Teachy space because that's where our show notes happen to be. But I also have a document open in a separate tab that's in my personal workspace because that was open before we got on Skype together. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by DevonThink. Have you ever found yourself wondering, where did I put my evil genius master plan? Well, that's a question that would never come up with DevonThink and DevonThink to Go. They are comprehensive document and information management solutions for the Mac and iOS. One place for storing all of your documents, snippets, or bookmarks and working with them. Integrated AI on the Mac assists you with filing and searching. There's an extensive search language with advanced Boolean operators too. Smart rules and flexible reminders let you automate all parts of your workflow and delegate the boring, repetitive tasks to automations you create. Let DevonThink automatically organize your data with rules you define. For example, imprint PDFs without touching them yourself. The app features flexible sync support with many cloud services and local syncing available. On top of everything else, your data is securely encrypted. And of course, there's so much more, from email archiving and scanning to an embedded web server for sharing your data securely with your team. A brand new version of the iOS companion app is now available too, with a modernized UI, OCR, shortcuts support, and much more. I love the new UI and OCR support, as well as the shortcuts actions. They're just huge to this update. Now, PDFs are text searchable without the need for a Mac in the process, and the shortcuts actions include thoughtful parameters that make more sophisticated shortcuts possible. Listeners of this show can get a 10% discount on DevonThink 3 and upgrades by going to devontechnologies.com/appstories. Again, that URL to get 10% off is devontechnologies.com/appstories. Our thanks to DevonThink for their support of the show. I have been working on a bunch of different things, but before I get to, I guess it's a little bit of an accessory gripe. I want to ask people to maybe go and review app stories. We haven't asked anybody to do that probably in a couple of years. And I was visiting the podcast app, and I noticed there were a couple of what I thought were kind of unfair reviews on there, and that it hasn't been getting a lot of love lately. And the reason I ask isn't so much because I just want to go to the podcast app and see all 5-star reviews. That would be nice. But it does help with discovery in terms of surfacing the podcast at least in Apple's app. So if people have the time, maybe click on it and put a rating in there. We'd certainly appreciate it. And if you are listening to this show and haven't checked out Unwind yet, Mac Stories Unwind is a show that Federico and I do every Friday that recaps the week at Mac Stories. And what's nice about it is if you have a busy week and you haven't been visiting the site, it's a way in roughly a half an hour to find out all the stories we wrote. Also find out what happened on App Stories if you haven't gotten to that yet. Plus, we always have some Unwind picks for the weekend. It's anything from movies and TV shows to music and books and video games, all sorts of things. Just stuff that Federico and I are enjoying at the moment. And we each do a pick every week. So that's a lot of fun too. So go check it out. In terms of what's new with me, I have been struggling with keyboards and trackpads, Federico.
Why?
Well, I'm really tired of having a full-size keyboard. I really don't. I like the Logitech MX Keys keyboard, but I'm not a super big fan of having the number pad next to it. And I got out my Apple keyboard, my Apple Magic Keyboard, and I really like that shallow key throw, the nice slim, small keyboard. And I started using that, but then I realized, well, I'm testing this 12 South Hoverbar Duo, and the Logitech keyboard is really great because it has these 3 buttons that let you switch between different devices really quickly. And I really want that so I could switch the keyboard over very quickly to the iPad if I've got it next to my Mac. And so I kind of went back to it after a couple of days. And then the other issue I have is with trackpads, because the trackpad, it's not super easy to move a trackpad from a Mac to an iPad and then back again. You have to go into the Bluetooth settings usually. It's just not as smooth as when you hit a button on one of these Logitech keyboards and things just shift over almost instantaneously. So what I really kind of would like would be a keyboard like the Logitech MX Keys, but smaller, like the Apple Magic Keyboard, because I want the functionality of being able to switch to different devices quickly, but I want the small, narrow keyboard that's just the main keys, right? I want that.
Why does this keyboard not exist?
It doesn't. I looked again
I
yesterday.
had the same exact problem a few days ago because I changed my desk setup to use the Studio Dock by Kensington that I reviewed on Mac Stories. And because there's no keyboard like that. So basically what I want is a compact Magic Keyboard with support for multi-device switching. That's all I want. And the backlit, I mean, if it's backlit, even better. But it doesn't exist. And you know what my solution is right now, John? When I'm not using the Mac Mini, I take the Magic Keyboard and the Magic Trackpad for the Mac Mini and I hide them in a drawer because that's all I can do.
No, look, when I was doing the Big Sur review, I kind of resorted to having separate keyboards and stuff for both systems that I was using because in some respects it was easier. Now, as much as I'd like that for the keyboard, I'd also like it for the trackpad because, Logitech makes the MX Master Mouse, which is really good too. And it too, it's a little bit more of a hassle. You have to turn it over and press a button on the bottom, but it switches really easily and quickly too. But there's no trackpad that does that. You can't do that with Apple's trackpads. So if I'm switching between the iPad and the Mac Mini, I can't do that. I have to have I actually have 2 Magic Trackpads, and one of them's for my iPad and one of them's for my Mac Mini, which is a waste. And it's also kind of a hassle. And like you, then I have to put that unused trackpad somewhere in a drawer or whatever, or clutter up my desk. I'd just like everything to easily switch between different Apple devices which shouldn't be so hard given the fact that we've got things like AirPods that do fast switching between devices. I want that with everything that's Bluetooth that Apple makes.
Oh man, imagine. Oh wow, I never thought of that. Imagine a
Yeah,
Magic Keyboard, but with the same wireless chip of the AirPods.
right.
Oh man, why'd you have to mention that? Now I want it.
I've been hoping for this for a long time. So I hope we get there. I hope we get there. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Revenue Cat. You're building something special, an experience that your users will love. Don't get bogged down with complex subscription code and receipt checking. Let Revenue Cat do all of that for you. Using Revenue Cat to power your app's in-app purchases solves for edge cases you don't even know that you have, and it protects you from outages your team hasn't even seen yet. Plus, it saves you time on future maintenance and features released by the app stores. Revenue Cat empowers your product and marketing teams with clean and reliable IAP data so they can make better decisions to help your app grow. Revenue Cat handles all of the headaches of building in-app purchase infrastructure so you don't have to. That way, you can get back to building the best app for your users. Revenue Cat supports iOS, macOS, Android, and Stripe. They also make it easy to verify subscription status across multiple platforms. Try doing that yourself. It's not easy unless, of course, you use Revenue Cat. They provide all the tools you need to quickly set up and manage any in-app purchase model, from simple to-do list apps to complex cross-platform subscriptions. They have SDKs for iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, Android, React Native, Flutter, Cordova, Unity, and macOS, including Catalyst. And Revenue Cat even has a free tier for side projects. It's free until you ship, even for the biggest apps. So you can spend your time building your app, not a subscription backend. It's harder than ever to stand out on the App Store. Don't spend your time writing backend code for your subscription. Let Revenue Cat do that while you focus on creating an experience that will surprise and delight your users. Relieve all of your subscription worries by going to RevenueCat.com right now to get started for free. Again, that's RevenueCat.com to get started for free. Our thanks to Revenue Cat for their support of App Stories. All right, Federico, we have lots and lots of wishes today, and why don't we get to the main topic, which is read it later apps, and the fact that, I thought about this because I know that you've been experimenting with read it later apps recently, and I've never been 100% satisfied with my options either. So it got me thinking we ought to talk about this, because almost a year ago, we did an episode on what we would consider the perfect research app. And to me, this seems like a natural extension of that, because read it later apps is really just another way to do research, at least in our line of work. So I thought we would talk a little bit about what we think makes the best read it later app, what's out there, what we like, what we don't like, and what we feel like is missing from the current crop on the App Store.
All right. Yeah. So I think before we get into that, and before we get into my whole journey into this category of apps lately, really over the past month, I think it's important that we explain the distinction that we do, that at least that I do, I think you're the same, between different flavors of read later apps and the difference with bookmarking apps, because I think it's important to point this out. I think there's a very clear separation between apps that are read later apps, or that, like Reader, for example, have a very specific read later mode as a feature in the app, versus other apps that are more like bookmark managers or services and apps that let you save links. So, for example, Raindrop, it's a bookmarking service. You can use it as a read later app, like I did. You can sort of make it work for you as a read later app. You can do things like, when I save a link, by default, save it into this collection. Or when I open a link, by default, open it in Safari View Controller with Safari Reader activated. So you can configure it to work as a read later app, but primarily it is a bookmarking utility to save links and bookmarks from around the web. Similarly, I know of plenty of folks who say, well, I never used a read later app. All I need is a Pinboard client because I save all my links to Pinboard and I tag the links that I want to read later with, something like a hashtag read later. And that's my read later setup. And I'm glad that that works for people, but still that doesn't change the fact that you're using a bookmarking service, in this case, Pinboard, and you're working your way around it to find a read later mode that doesn't really exist on its own. You are building it yourself, essentially. And
Right.
I've done that myself. Like I've did it for Raindrop a few weeks ago, and it's totally possible. But I think it's important to point out the difference between a read later app versus something else that you can make it work like that, sort of.
Right. I've used GoodLink that way too, because it's that kind of app where what you're really doing is you're saving the link, and you can save it for all sorts of reasons. It may be just more like reference materials and that sort of thing, but there are modes in those apps where you can use them for reading, but that's not, they're not limited to that.
Yeah. So that being said, I have been going down this rabbit hole of I literally searched for read later on the App Store, and I downloaded anything I could find, including some apps that had a Chinese description and Chinese screenshots.
Oh, I know which one you probably are talking about.
Yeah,
because
something
I
called
had this recently.
Something called Qbox or something like that.
Yep, that's the one. That's the one I tried.
I mean, it did look pretty interesting from the screenshots, and I think it's got some interesting ideas. However, there's some parts of the application that are in Chinese only, and I don't speak and I don't understand Chinese.
So is the webpage for signing up for the service.
Yeah, and the webpage is in Chinese. I think you can use sign in with Apple, which I think is what I did. For these kinds of apps that I'm not familiar with the developer, it's always reassuring when I see sign in with Apple, because I know,
Right.
Hey, at least there's the Apple service taking care of me here. In any case, I kind of wanted to. Do you want to know what I'm using now up front?
Yeah, why don't you tell me, and I'll share that too.
Okay, so right now, after much experimentation, I'm back to where I started months ago, which is I'm not using any app on my phone or iPad. I'm using my physical Kindle Oasis to read articles that I save from around the web using this fancy bookmarklet that I pay for. It's actually a web service. They have a Patreon membership. It's called Push to Kindle. And Push to Kindle is, as the name implies, it's a web service to push stuff from the web to your Kindle. You configure your personal Kindle email address that Amazon gives you, and you can also install an iOS app, actually. They have an iOS app that all it does is it's got a share extension. But I prefer the bookmarklet, because when you press it in Safari, you get this preview page that shows you the text extracted from the article, and it gives you options for how you want to save it to your Kindle. It's really well done. If you become a Patreon member of Push to Kindle, you can save more articles on a monthly basis, and you get access early to beta versions of Push to Kindle. And I will say up front that Push to Kindle has the best text parser that I've tried. It's really, really good at extracting text and images from articles and getting rid of other stuff. It's not perfect, but nothing really is perfect in that regard with read later apps. And what I love, obviously, is, well, two things. The simplicity of it. From any article in Safari, I can just press a bookmarklet and it goes straight to my Kindle. I don't have to think about anything else. But obviously what I love is the experience on the Kindle itself, like reading on the Kindle with an e-ink display, having that separation, that distraction-free environment, and the ability to look up any word, like any definition via the Kindle dictionary very quickly, but also to highlight anything that I find in an article, which I'm going to talk about later. It's a really good experience. It's a really focused experience. And I like how I can then later sort my Kindle library by type. So I can choose, hey, I want to see books, or in this case, I want to see personal documents, because this is how effectively you are saving an HTML document to your Kindle account. This is how, and push to Kindle is not the only service, but this is how these services work. They create these personal documents, as Amazon calls them. And in the Kindle, on the Kindle device, and also in the Kindle app for iPhone and iPad, you can say, show me books or show me documents, show me the unread ones. So it's really easy to sort through your saved articles. And
Right.
I'm using this, as I mentioned, because I'm not completely happy with any dedicated solution on iOS. But we're going to talk about this today, in hoping that we can explain what we would like to see. Because if given the option, I would love to use an iPhone or iPad app that matches my requirements. It just doesn't exist.
All right, I have a couple of questions for you, and I
Sure.
think the main one is, how do you get articles back out of the Kindle if you want to?
That's really the main problem.
Right.
I gotta use the iPhone app.
I see.
If I want to
Right.
get the highlights out of the document, I gotta use Kindle on the iPhone or iPad. Or if I just want to find the article again, I just have to Google for it manually.
Oh, you can't get the URL out?
No, that's not
see, that's
how
a deal breaker for me.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah. Because see, that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, is because I feel like Read It Later apps do a really good job of getting things into them, but not always such a good job of getting things out of them again. And I think that there's a reason for that. I mean, at least there's a historical reason. And I think there's probably just a lot of users who all they want to do is park something somewhere, tag it maybe in some kind of organized fashion, read it, and then be done with it. The problem is I use Read It Later services as part of a workflow, really, where everything in my Read It Later I consider it temporary. I don't even necessarily want it in, I don't want it in there long term. I'm not storing things to be able to search them necessarily even. I want to maybe delete everything out of there at some point. It's all there with the purpose of either just reading it for my own personal pleasure, or it's there because I think it's something I might want to link to or put in the club newsletter or whatever it is. And in that case, where it's something that I want to do something with, write about, it has to come back out again. And it has to come out in a way that in a format that works for me. So maybe that is, it comes out as markdown and it gets dropped into an iWriter document where I can start writing about it right away, or something else. But that requires things like shortcut support. It helps that there's tagging so I can keep things organized. I don't have like a complicated organizational structure. I've really tried to keep tags and folders and those things to a minimum in all the apps that I'm using these days, because it gets so messy and cluttered. But I do like to separate out things that are like for the website or for the club or just personal, that kind of thing. And that's why the Kindle is appealing, because I haven't used a Kindle in a very long time, and it's appealing from a reading standpoint, but I think I would have issues with it in terms of using that process as a tool to do things related to Mac Stories work.
And I think there's a fundamental difference, I think, between us in the way that we save things for later. So I think you tend to save in your Read Later app of choice a lot of links, even if they're not necessarily like stories that you want to sit down and read. Like, you tend to save a lot of things for, I don't know, stuff that you want to discuss with me or ideas for future stories. Like, they're not just articles that you want to read.
That
you save
is
a bunch of stuff. Whereas I only save stories that I want to read. Like a few months ago, I signed up for both the New York Times and the New Yorker. And like that, those are the types of stories that I like, long form stuff that I want to sit down and read. Because for other types of bookmarking, I use either Raindrop, or I just drop a link in Craft, for example. So it works for me because I try to be very careful about the stuff that I save in my Read Later. But
yeah, mine is very much an inbox.
There's also a lot of people like you that tend to save a bunch of stuff and then want to be able to say, okay, give me, let me browse all these different links that I've saved.
I think that's right. Although I think probably people like me are in the minority, in the sense that a lot of people are just looking to read something, and I'm using it like an inbox. I'm using it like, a temporary destination. And, so everybody knows, I'm using Reader at the moment, because Reader allows me to tag things the way I like, so that it's organized. I also just really love the design of Reader. The one thing that drives me a little crazy about Reader is that it's got the great 3-pane view on the iPad that, was debuted with iOS 14. But I do sometimes like to just read the article and not have the columns next to it. And you can collapse those columns. But when you collapse the last column on the left on Reader, it switches the view from the Reader view to the web page. And I don't like that. I like Reader's styling and
okay, I see.
right. So when you can get rid of your account column, but you can't get rid of the article list column without it switching to a web page. And the reason I'm using Reader is in part for the not have all the distraction and to have kind of the uniform look from article to article. And that's one of the things that bothers me the most about Reader. But other than that, the design is fantastic. It's highly customizable, but even just the default looks so good and it's so readable that I can go through a lot of links very quickly. Because one of the things I do now, because it's got good shortcut support too, is that during the week, as I read through my RSS, because this is built in, the Read It Later service and Reader is built into its RSS reader, I move things into a tag called Weekly. And towards the end of the week, when we're getting ready to put the issue together, I go through that. And if there's some of the stuff I just delete because I'm like, this really isn't that good. Other things, I move to a new tag called Latest Issue. And then I have shortcuts that allow me to generate a list of all those URLs, open tabs for all of them, and then just read them all and write about them really quickly all at once.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that issue with the columns in Reader. But
Yeah.
now that you mentioned Reader, I want to talk about one of the things that I always look for in a Read Later app that I think Reader does a pretty good job at dealing with this is the reading experience itself. And you
Yes.
mentioned how Reader is very elegant for reading long form content. It's got some options to tweak the article styling, for example. But really, what I appreciate about Reader, even though I agree with you that the way that it switches from the Reader view to the web page version, it's not ideal. But what I like about it overall is that it's got both options, right? So it has
Right.
its own custom Reader view with its own text parser for extracting text and images from a web page. But it also lets you very easily, either with a gesture or by tapping on the article title, to switch to Safari View Controller. And I think these are the two primary differentiating factors between Read Later apps. There's those that use Safari View Controller, and there's those that come with their own text, sort of text-only mode. Now, there's advantages to both systems. With Safari View Controller, you get the original website look, which I think is important because for a lot of people, and I also sometimes get this feeling, when you're using a text-only mode, it almost feels like you're not reading the original website. Like, sometimes I want to see that an article is from The Verge, or it's from Polygon, or
Right.
from
Right.
Wired.
Well, and sometimes it loses author information,
Yeah,
or some of the images disappear.
you lose that
kind of thing.
identity of the original publication. And sometimes I feel that way. And with Safari View Controller, you get the original web page, but you also maintain access to your content blockers. So if you're one of those people blocking, annoyances on the web, Safari View Controller lets you keep those, as well as your extensions and all of your shortcuts. So it's like using Safari, but it's inside your Read Later app of choice. And obviously,
Right.
Safari View Controller also means you can use Safari's own reader mode, which is really good. Apple did it's one of the best text parsers out there. I think alongside Push to Kindle, it's probably one of the best ones. And it also comes with options for text zoom and fonts and colors, and it's really well done. And like we mentioned before, there's an API for third-party developers to say, open Safari View Controller in reader mode by default, so that when you open a link, it automatically switches to reader mode. The advantage of a custom text-only mode like Reader or like Pocket or like Articles Plus, which is another utility that I wrote about a couple of weeks ago on Club Mac Stories. These are effectively custom text views or custom web views the developers have full control over. Obviously, as a developer, you got to come up with your own text parser for extracting data from the original web page and presenting the text. However, you're then free to do things like highlights, for example, highlighting text in the article, which is not something that you can do, unfortunately, in Safari because there's no API for developers to do highlights on a Safari web page on iOS. You can do whatever you want with the text. You can do highlights. You can do notes. You can do footnotes. This is something that Instapaper, for example, does.
Right.
They have footnote popovers and highlights. Articles Plus also has support for adding comments and highlights to an article because it's got a custom text only reader mode. Now, the issue here, obviously, is that text parsers are really difficult to get right. And a lot of apps, you'll see that they will likely miss some key elements from the original web page. Like, for example, in Articles Plus, whenever you save a newsletter from Substack, which is not really a newsletter, it's a web page hosted on substack.com, because they use the so-called lazy loading for images, all of those articles are without images in Articles Plus.
Yeah.
So there's these little things that doing a custom text parser involves, and you got to be mindful of that because the experience will not be the same as reading in Safari.
Right. And, when I say I don't like that Reader switches over to the Safari view controller when you hide all the columns, I don't mean to suggest that I don't want Safari view controller in Reader, because I absolutely do. I think it is beneficial to have that, and it also gives you a lot more options when it comes to using the share sheet for getting things out of an app like Reader, because sometimes the text versions that are, the rendered text versions don't share as well as something out of Safari view controller. I just wish that it didn't automatically switch to it and that it was my option when I hit all those columns. I guess the other thing about Reader that I wish it supported is drag and drop, because that's just another thing when I'm doing something where I'm trying to get a link out and I've got it in split view with IA Writer or something like that. It'd be nice to be able to just drag that link straight into a text document as I'm writing. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pinstachio. Do you use Pinboard for saving bookmarks online? Perhaps for keeping track of read it later lists? Pinstachio is a Pinboard app for iOS that uses a simple, modern, unique interface, allowing you to enjoy a great experience when viewing your bookmarks. As a free app, Pinstachio will allow you to easily catch up with your unread bookmarks. A single tap is all it takes to show you those unread items. The premium version, Pinstachio Plus, offers much more and becomes a full-fledged Pinboard client that allows you to add, manage, and edit your bookmarks. Pinstachio will use your browser of choice. It supports iOS 14's default browser option, or you can manually choose one of 6 different supported browsers. With a tap of the info button, you can quickly see and edit the bookmark. It even shows a quick image preview. Your bookmarks are also searchable and can be filtered using other parameters like tags. A must for any Pinboard app, it includes a share extension for quickly saving URLs to your Pinboard account. On top of that, Pinstachio includes widgets for showing random unread bookmarks and stats. And of course, it supports other things we take for granted in iOS, like full dark mode support, background refresh, and multitasking to keep your favorite browser side by side with Pinstachio. There's usually a 2-week free trial for Pinstachio Plus, but to thank App Stories listeners, the free trial has been extended to 2 full months, available to any new user for a limited time. To learn more about Pinstachio, go to pinstachio.com. Again, that URL is pinstachio.com. Our thanks to Pinstachio for their support of the show. I think we should talk about highlighting a little more, Federico, because I know you do that. And I'm curious, I guess, one, why you do it, and if you have any use for those highlights after you after you've made them. Where do you
All
store
right.
them? Do you ever go back to them? That kind of thing. I like highlighting. I wish Reader had that. And I know like Instapaper has it, and a few others things have. I think Pocket has it as well. But you don't see it in some of the more dedicated RSS readers as much.
All right. So first of all, in case it wasn't clear, my preference in terms of Safari View Controller and a custom text-only mode is both. My
You're right,
ideal
exactly.
Read Later app has both of them, like Reader. However, and it should be easy to switch between them. So again, I think Reader is pretty much perfect in that regard because it lets you switch with a single gesture or a single tap. There's no menu involved. Now, I also want the custom text-only mode because it's usually faster to open than having to open Safari View Controller and having to open the Reader mode. In apps like Pocket or Reader, you just tap on an article in your list and it loads with its own text-only version. But I also want it because I want to be able to highlight stuff. Now, highlighting things for me, the highlights that I add are mostly for personal knowledge of sorts. Like I really like to highlight certain passages of text with, I don't know, facts or quotes that I like. And I like being able to archive them and find them again later. It's something that I've always done when reading books, revisiting certain passages of text or certain quotes. It's something that I really enjoy doing. And unfortunately, in the Read Later ecosystem of apps, very few apps do this. And none of them do it right, if by doing it right, we mean the teachy way. So Pocket and Instapaper, they let you both highlight stuff. Instapaper even lets you add your own comment to the highlight. Articles Plus also lets you highlight and add notes. However, Pocket does not let you export highlights at all. There's no export feature in the iOS app, and there's no web integration for highlights. So it's not like you can say, like in services like IFTTT or Zapier, do things like if there's a new highlight, save it, to Notion or something. Articles Plus, actually no, Instapaper lets you share highlights from the iPhone and iPad app, and it works. My problem is that Instapaper, it kind of feels old at this point.
Yeah, it doesn't get many updates these days.
It doesn't get many updates these days. It's not using any of the modern iPadOS and iOS stuff like widgets and shortcuts actions and multi-column, multi-window. And, it's not the kind of experience that I want to trust going forward.
They have shortcuts, but it's very basic shortcuts.
Yeah, I wish those guys the best. It's just what I'm looking for is something modern that is actively developed, that it receives. Doesn't have to be weekly updates like Craft, but not even, you open the app, so you see last update last year. It's not a great sign. And then Articles Plus, it lets you share all the highlights from an article with a share sheet, I believe in Markdown as well. But the issue is that it doesn't have a web component at all. So what in my ideal Read Later app, support for highlights has to be twofold. I want to be able to share from my iPhone or iPad either individual highlights or all the highlights from the current story as HTML or Markdown with the share sheet with extensions. I don't want to see any stupid marketing like watermark style text at the bottom. Apple itself is guilty of this. When you share
with the books, it's terrible.
With the books marketing text, every time you share something from the Books app, it's got that stupid text, which I wrote shortcuts with regular expressions just to get rid of that text. So in addition to sharing from iOS and iPadOS, my ideal service has a web API with integration with Zapier and similar services so that I can share my highlights to whatever I want. A lot of people these days, they like to save their highlights to Notion or to a service called Readwise, which is a really fascinating aggregator for all the things you read. It's got support for Kindle, It's got support for exporting highlights to Notion. And I think it's important to have that kind of integration if you're building a reading experience these days. So both local export and web API support. And then in the app itself, even after I've archived the article, I would love to have a highlights section where I go to that section and I see all of my highlights and I can search them so that it becomes easy for me to, over time revisit the things I've saved as highlights. Sure. And I can read them again and I can share them again.
Yeah, I like that. That's like almost like a special tagged category
Yes.
in the app, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be really nice to have. I mean, yeah, it's interesting to me that this isn't out there. I mean, because what you want to have is the ultimate flexibility to get things out again, especially with the highlights. Because as you said, a web API would be terrific because not only could you do things like Notion, but you could use Airtable, or you could export as a CSV and just open it in a spreadsheet, Google Sheets, whatever it happens to be, whatever you like. And that would work really well. You could even just use it, export it as a list of text, and create documents straight from that if you wanted to.
Yeah. Now, on the topic of web API, we mentioned this a few minutes ago. Obviously, with the Read Later app, it needs to be super easy to save stuff into the app and to take it out of the app. So integration with other apps, I think, is another essential point here. A share extension, pretty obvious, right? You need to be able to share an article from Twitter or Safari or RSS on your iPhone, on your iPad as quickly as possible. So you want to have a share extension.
And you want to have shortcuts with parameters.
And you want to have shortcuts with parameters. But shortcuts, not just, and this is also an important point, not just to save data into the app.
No, to get it out.
But to get it out. And in this case, the app that does it right is Reader. So once again, Reader has shortcut actions for saving links to the app with parameters for the URL and for tags. Really well done. And it's also got shortcuts actions to take articles out of the app, again, with parameters, with support for filtering by tag, filtering by title, returning multiple matches and choosing from a list. Really, really well done. I had a bit of a back and forth with Reader developer Silvio Rizzi last year when they were working on these actions, and I sort of shared some feedback. So these actions, super well done. You gotta have that kind of integration. A bookmarklet, why not? If you are a web service, I think especially for a lot of desktop users, it could be useful to have that kind of access, especially on Windows, because on the Mac, you should, if you're a developer, you should do what the Raindrop developer does, which is a native Safari extension. Now that Safari on the Mac has native extensions, you can find a Raindrop extension on the Mac App Store. It even supports the latest M1 Macs. That's the way to go. For Mac users, you got to have that.
You do. And it's interesting because on the Mac, you have kind of a choice between doing a Safari extension or doing a share extension. And I think by and large, I like the Safari extensions better when it's right there in context. Although I don't think it necessarily hurts to have both.
No,
because,
it doesn't.
If you have the share extension, maybe that's just a very quick way to save a link into your Read Later service. Whereas with this Safari extension, maybe you have more, parameters that you can fill out, like tags and things like that.
Yeah. And lastly, obviously, a web API.
Right.
Because I really feel like the more, especially in the productivity market, the more people, start gravitating toward services like a Notion. And Craft, I believe, they're also working on web-based integrations. The more it becomes obvious that a Read Later app should be able to communicate with those services, those apps that people use to archive the things they read, to archive highlights and notes and links. So I think it's really important to have that kind of integration. Plus, I just think it's useful to have different ways to save data into the Read Later app, and to save links and to export those links with a web API.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And when we talk about things like Safari View Controller, it's Safari View Controller is so good. That's what really enables things, bookmarking services to become read it later apps, just because its reader mode is so good. But I like you, really do want a custom reader view as well as Safari View Controller as both options in the same app. And that's one thing that I think Reader does especially well.
Yeah. So I saved the fun part for last. This is the other, I guess, in addition to highlights, the other meaty part for me. Right. Organization and presentation of articles. Now, too many read later apps, they do just one thing. When you save a link, they just dump all of those links in a single bucket, in a single inbox, and it grows over time, and it grows and it grows, and it makes you feel bad. Because then you got to do, well, I guess I'm just going to declare read later bankruptcy and I'm going to start over. And I feel like that's not I get it. It's the default approach, right? The inbox, just like in a task manager or just like in an email client. But what I would like to see is something a little more clever, something a little more intelligent, something inspired, I think, by what some RSS readers are doing these days. And particularly, I think Fiery Feeds and Lear are onto something right here. So ideally, what I would love to see is what I called auto tagging. So a way for me to say in my Read Later app, something very simple. Whenever I save an article from, say, 9to5mac.com or macrumors.com, automatically apply the Apple tag. Something like that. So automatic tagging for stories. But I would go even a step further and say, don't use just the domain name as the condition. Maybe something like a keyword contained in the title. Or maybe the name of the author, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And if you think about it, this is exactly what Fiery Feeds and Lear are doing. They have these specific filters and they have this understanding of the contents of an article. And they provide you with different ways to browse your RSS feeds. They have website filters. They have author filters. They can present you articles based on their length, based on the frequency with which a certain website publishes new items. So I guess what I'm saying is some read later apps like Pocket, again, like Reader, they let you tag your stories. And that is great. I love being able to manually tag stuff. But I also think it's important to have an automatic tagging function based, again, on conditions like the domain or the title or the author to make it easy for the read later queue to sort of organize itself over time. Because what I dislike is this idea of opening my read later app and being paralyzed by the choice of dozens and dozens of articles that I've saved. So I think it's important for the read later app to sort of sort itself over time. And I would go a step beyond that and say, in addition to a better organization, so browsing by author, browsing by tag, automatic tagging, browsing by website, if I were a developer of a read later app, I would consider also different ways to make it easy for users to get started reading. So something that Pocket is doing right now, they're testing on Android devices, a way for you to choose articles based on how much time you have. And that is a really clever feature. So I've seen the screenshots on The Verge. They will do something like, have 5 minutes, here's a short story from the ones you've saved. Or if you want to sit down and enjoy a longer 30-minute story from The New Yorker, there's a different section for that. So I think another way to organize the read later queue and adapt to the user's needs and context, I think that's a really clever idea. Now, I wouldn't try to be too clever with those suggestions, which is why, Pocket, this is one thing they're doing right. But on the other hand, I also dislike how heavily Pocket, which is owned by Mozilla, I keep forgetting this, how heavily and aggressively they push their own like recommendations and like
right.
featured page. Like
And
I don't
the social
the
aspects
social
of it.
like I don't want any of that. But I
Yeah.
think sorting articles based on length and doing things like what they're doing on Android, that is really interesting, and more apps should consider it.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a recognition amongst Read It Later app makers and at least RSS app makers that this bucket is a problem, because widgets, there's a lot of widgets out there which will show you 5 articles randomly from your feeds or something like that. And that kind of gets at the issue, but it's also random. And I think, what you're suggesting with smart filters makes a lot more sense. The other thing I'd kind of throw onto the pile as something that I think these apps should have is not just functionality to archive, but functionality to delete. Because sometimes you save something, you're like, this is no good. And even if I'm archiving so that I can search things in the future, I don't want a lot of junk in there because I want to be able to find what I'm looking for. And so the ability to delete, I think, is important too, because people use these services in different ways, especially like, if I have links that I've saved for the club, most of those are going to get deleted at the end of the day because they serve their purpose and I'm done with them at the end of the week. But if it's something I saved, like that's a long form article that is really interesting to me, I want to keep, and I want to be able to find again, I want to be able to archive that. So having both of those, I think, is important.
Yeah. So basically, at the end of this conversation, I realized that the app that gets closest to meeting all of my requirements is probably Reader at the moment. But there's a lot of things that it's missing. No web API. It only lets you tag stuff manually. No highlights. So Reader gets close. Pocket, maybe, but there's a lot of overhead in Pocket. And so it's for this reason that because the perfect Read Later app doesn't exist, for now, I'm continuing to use my Kindle because the Kindle is completely disconnected, doesn't have basically any of these features. But hey, at least I know I'm getting a fantastic reading experience because of the e-ink display on the Kindle. But I would love to have this kind of app on my phone, on my iPad. And I realized that it may never exist. So I guess we did a podcast episode about it in hoping that someone out there will listen to us and will at least consider some of these features.
Right. We understand that this is a very tall order because we're basically asking for the apps that we like, but a whole lot more.
Yes, basically. Yes.
All right, Federico. Well, that's a good place to stop. I hope that we have that app someday. I mean, it's there's a lot of things to consider for this sort of app. I want to thank our 3 sponsors again, and that is DevonThink, Revenue Cat, and Pinstachio. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico's on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.